start now, okay? So officially welcome. This is the last of our open lecture series that started last semester, entitled Indigenous Peoples and Local Communities Dialogues, Transcultural Dialogues for Environmental Justice. As usual, in our sessions,
I got this book.
if you can turn your mics off and your cameras on, that would be brilliant. Um, what? Yes, perfect. So um, today we have here Monica Borges, and as usual in our open lecture series, the sessions will be held in Portuguese, as we are directly discussing with people trying to make a change on the territories in the Brazilian landscape. And we have provided by our amazing team led by Renata Manzano interpretation on the globe.
No.
I can't. Okay. So to have interpretation, you need to click on the small globe on the bottom of your screen. Please make sure that you find it. It might be inside the three little dots called More. And then you click on the interpretation, and then you can choose a language. You can choose either English or Portuguese, and you can also choose to mute the original audio. If you choose just English, you're going to listen to Monica speaking in Portuguese in the background. And if you mute her, you can just listen to the English directly. I'm really glad that you're all here. And without further ado, I'm going to pass on the floor to Bruno Tarim, my colleague and co-organizer of this open lecture series. Bruno will be speaking in Portuguese and also Monica. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining. Bruno?
Olá, pessoal.
Hello, everyone.
Bom dia para quem está
Good
aqui. Boa
morning for
tarde.
those who are here. Good afternoon for
Eu só
those
gostaria de
who are
agradecer a
in
vocês.
Brazil. I just want to
Infelizmente,
thank
na
you
última
very much. Unfortunately,
palestra aberta que a gente fez,
in the last
eu não pude estar
open
presente.
lecture, I
Mas agora a gente
couldn't
está
come.
fechando aí
I wasn't able to
de
attend.
uma maneira muito
However, today we're going
especial.
to close
A Mônica é
with
uma convidada
a
que a gente
very
queria muito
special
que
guest.
participasse.
Monica is the person we really wanted to have here.
Só agradecer a vocês e
And
relembrar
well,
pouco qual foi o nosso
I just wanted
percurso,
to thank you very much, and
Porque,
maybe we could recap
esse semestre nós
our
só realizamos
trajectory.
duas, mas semestre
In this
passado
semester,
a
we
gente
had 2
organizou
open lectures. However,
uma
last
primeira
semester better, we
representação
had some
do
others.
Movimento Sem
The
Terra,
first one
né?
with the
Depois a gente
landless
teve uma
movement.
palestra do movimento indígena
Then
do
we
Nordeste
had
do Brasil.
another one with the indigenous movement of the
Depois
northeast of
disso, a gente teve
Brazil.
uma palestra
Afterwards, we had
do
another one
CNS,
with
que é um movimento
CNS, which is a
ligado ao
movement
legado
connected
do Chico
to
Mendes na Amazônia,
Chico
né, com as
Mendes'
comunidades
legacy
extrativistas,
in the
seringueiros,
Amazon with the
originalmente, né, começou nesse
extractivist
movimento.
um,
Depois a gente teve uma
communities
palestra mais
there.
ligada a povos e comunidades tradicionais,
And
ou
afterwards, we
comunidades
have
locais, né,
another one connected to
como todo no
the
Brasil, são
local
várias
traditional
outras, né.
communities.
Passamos então para uma outra palestra
We
sobre
then had another
quilombolas,
one
mas com um enfoque
regarding quilombolas, but
bastante
focusing
diferente do
more
que a Mônica vai dar hoje, porque
in a
tinha um componente muito
totally
ligado à
different
arte,
point of view
né,
from what
do
we're going to see
cineasta
today with Monica,
quilombola.
because it was very connected to art, the last
Finalizamos
one.
o semestre
He
passado,
was a
então, com uma
filmmaker.
apresentação sobre o
And
movimento indígena,
in the
daí
last
já
semester,
mais
we
ligado à
closed
ideia
with
do
a
movimento
lecture
indígena da
connected to
Amazônia,
the
do Brasil,
indigenous movement,
mas bem ligado à ideia de
specifically
arte
from the Amazon, but
contemporânea,
also
né, e
connected
produção
to
cultural. Então, nesse
contemporary
semestre, a gente teve
and
uma
cultural production,
sobre o uso de
contemporary art,
ferramentas, né,
and cultural production.
geográfico, né?
Then we
Do
saw
curso.
another lecture this year, this
Para
semester, connected to the
apoiar os
technology
Yanomami,
and
né?
tech
Os
tools
indígenas
that
da
could
Amazônia também.
support the
E agora
Yanomamis,
estamos
the
fechando
indigenous
a
people
última com a
of
Mônica
the
Borges.
Amazon. And today
A
we're
Mônica, eu
closing
vou
with
apresentar
Monica
aqui
Borges.
rapidinho, mas ela pode se
Just to
apresentar de novo,
introduce
se ela
her,
quiser, né? À
but
vontade,
she
Mônica.
can
Ela é
speak
quilombola do
if she
território
will. She's
de
Quilombola from the territory
Itamatatuia,
of
ou
Itamatatuia
Alcântara, né? Ela
or
é
Alcântara.
advogada,
She's a
especialista no direito
lawyer
quilombola pela
and specialized
Universidade
in
Federal do Pará,
Quilombola
e
rights
atualmente exerce função
from
de
the
diretora
Pará
na
University,
Periferia
and
dos
nowadays
Territórios
she's
Quilombolas
working as a
do
director
Instituto Nacional
in
de
the board
Valorização da Reforma
of
Agrária, que
Quilombola
sempre
lands
fala
in
INCRA
the
no
Institute
Brasil.
of Agrarian
Então é
Reform
isso,
that we
só
called
agradecer
INCRA in
vocês que
Brazil.
estão presentes
That's it.
e
I
pedir
just
para a
want to thank
Mônica
you very
poder
much
agora
for
fazer sua
coming, and now
apresentação.
I'm gonna ask Monica to start her presentation.
Mônica, tá por aí?
Monica, are you there? Yes, I
Oi,
am.
gente, boa tarde.
Hello,
tudo bem
everyone.
com
Good
vocês?
afternoon.
Meu nome é Mônica Borges. Vou
My
falar
name is
só,
Monica
apresentar de
Borges.
novo, Bruno, só porque o
I'm
nome
gonna
da minha
introduce
community
myself
saiu
again just
errado, viu?
because the name of my community
Meu nome é
was
Mônica
misspelled.
Borges, eu sou
My name is
quilombola
Monica
do
Borges.
território
I'm
de
Quilombola
Itamatatiba, em
from the
Alcântara, né?
territory of
Aqui no estado do
Itamatatiba in
Maranhão, aqui no
Alcântara
Brasil.
in the
E aí
state
eu
of
inicio minha
Maranhão,
fala primeiro
Brazil.
parabenizando o Dr. Bruno
And
Oliveira
first of
Laila
all,
pela
I
excelente
want
iniciativa.
to congratulate Dr.
Eu acho muito
Laila and
importante
Dr.
que a nossa
Bruno
academia ela
on this
traga
initiative because I think
estudantes,
it's
né,
very important for
para
the
essa realidade
academy
prática, né? E a gente
to
tem um costume de
show
pensar na
this
academia
reality
focada
to students
nesse
because
conhecimento
most
e esses
cases
saberes
we see the
tradicionais, né, a partir,
academy
né,
far
desses
away
conjuntos de
from this
palestras, eu tenho
knowledges.
certeza que vai fazer
And
um
I'm
diferencial
sure
na
this set
formação
of
política
open
pedagógica aí
lecture
dos
is
estudantes
gonna
que
make
vocês
a
estão
difference in
adjuntos
the
aqui.
in
E
the
aí eu inicio minha fala dizendo, né,
education
que fui
of those
convidada
students.
para
And I
contribuir
just
com
want to
vocês um
start
pouquinho
by saying
sobre a
that
temática, né, da justiça
I was
ambiental
invited to
e
talk
trazer uma
about climate
fala né, que é
justice,
onde as
but I
comunidades
wanted
quilombolas,
also
onde
to
as
talk
comunidades
about
quilombolas
what has to do
enxergam a
with the
justiça ambiental.
Quilombola
E aí eu
communities and
fiz
how
uma
they
slidezinha
see
aqui
climate
bem
justice.
curto, né, só para que eu não consiga, para que eu
And here I have
consiga
just a
falar tudo o que eu
presentation to
pretendia,
show
né, nesse
you,
curto
just for me
espaço de
to
tempo,
organize the
porque
ideas in this
normalmente
short
falo
amount of
muito, né,
time I
e eu
have because
preciso
I
orientar
usually
minha
speak a
fala, tá
lot, so
bom?
I have
E eu vou
to be
compartilhar
guided
agora com
here.
vocês.
That's why we're gonna see this slide deck.
Tá tudo bem? Conseguiram ver?
Are you
Ótimo.
able to see it? Yes,
Perfeito.
it's
E aí, para
perfect.
iniciar minha fala, eu
Okay,
acho
and
importante
to
que
get
eu
it started,
traga
I think it's
duas
important to
premissas que
mention
são
two
orientadoras
premises
na construção do meu pensamento, né?
that guide
Primeiro
us
aqui
on the
para falar sobre
construction
justiça
of this
ambiental,
thought.
justiça climática,
To talk
ecologia,
about
é,
environmental,
existe uma
climate, justice, and
intersecção, na verdade,
ecology,
duas intersecções, elas
we
são
have two
indissociáveis, né?
intersections
Que é a
that cannot
questão
be separated.
do
One
racismo, né? A questão
has to do with
racial e a
racism,
questão da luta social.
racial
E aí
issues,
eu
and the other
divido
one
isso
has to do with
fundamentalmente a partir de
social
dois grandes pensadores.
rights.
O
And
primeiro
I'm gonna
pensador é
base
o Michael
my
Ferdinand.
thoughts on
O
two
Michael
different
Ferdinand, ele é um engenheiro
um,
florestal, ele é doutor em filosofia, e ele tem uma obra muito
theologians.
interessante que é
Malcolm
intitulada
Ferdinandi,
Uma Ecologia
who
Decolonial,
has a
pensar a partir do mundo caribenho.
book called
E aí, nesse
Ecology
livro,
from
ele traz
Decolonization
uma tese,
point
né?
of
Ele
view.
constrói uma tese
And
a
in this
partir
book,
de
he
duas
builds a thesis
ambientes distintos, né? Ele fala que
thinking
existe uma
about
fratura
two
na
perspectives.
modernidade. E essa
One that
fratura da
says
modernidade,
there
ela
is a
está
fracture in the
em um lugar
modernity,
onde estão os
and this
colonizadores
fracture
e os
is
colonizados, e
where
um outro
the
lugar onde está a humanidade
colonizers
e a natureza.
are
E ele
and
fala
the
isso para dizer
colonized,
que
and the
existe
other
uma
one
outra
where is the
lógica, né?
humanity
Que a
and nature.
construção
And the
do
logical thinking
capitalismo,
that
por
he brings
exemplo, é
for
subjugar
constructing
não só a terra,
capitalism
mas,
has to
sobretudo,
do with
subjugar as pessoas.
subjugate not
E
only
ele
the
vai
land but
construindo no
people
final, aqui
themselves.
um
And
pensamento que ele
he
entende como
builds
intrínseco, né? A
a
relação
thought
entre
that
uma luta
where he
antirracista
understands
e
that
a luta
the
ecológica, né? Então, ele fala
anti-racism
nesse
fight is
que para
connected
existir né,
to
uma
the
justiça
ecological fight.
ambiental e social se levar em consideração
And
todo o
there
agravo, né,
only be
decorrente do período
this
colonial.
the the ecological and climate justice if we work on the decolonization. And in this book, that really helps people to understand the reality, to leave a bit of the theory aside and see what's happening on a daily basis. He says that one of the strategies to really tackle and build climate justice for real has to do with the aquilombamento processes here in South America. Because what he says is the indigenous, traditional, and quilombolas communities, they are space of resistance. They resisted not only to a social system, but also a slavery system. And the way capitalism is proposed, where, and he thinks about a category that he called the colonial habitat. And by that, he means the colonizers, they explores some culture or minerals, but based in a slave trade. And they are away, they get themselves away from this. And the way they relate themselves with the world, it's a paradox with the capitalist world. And I think that's one of the main things. This is not a conversation that is going to be separated from one from another, racial issues and climate justice. And another person that I want to mention has to do with is Chico Mendes, and probably you have already heard about him. He was a rubber tapper, he was extractivist, and also member of the union. And he always said that they have to work, but with the standing forest. Then he always talked about the usage of the environment, but based on this. That's why politics is not far from this fight. And at some point, when some researchers started reviewing the process of Chico Mendes, they understood that there is no neutral ecology. It's impossible to think about social justice without taking into account everything that we have to use and to understand, for example, the political system or economics, the parties, political parties, I mean. So all this influences the social justice, and also we have to think in an ecology that takes into account the reality, the current reality. And by that, I mean, and at some point, I will have something that I will call the turning point, or is something that is a game changer here. When I'm going to talk about how quilombolas are seeing the climate justice, but also what are the things that they are doing to try, the government is trying to do to mitigate the social impacts. And it's important to mention that the quilombola communities, it's not only a political a justice category, but a political one. And it was categorized within the Brazilian right systems from the Constitution of 1988. So quilombo is used to designate Black rural communities. that owns their own trajectory and specific relationships with their Black ancestrality related to the period of slave trade. As they mentioned, as Malcolm mentioned, quilombos are resistance spaces where they refuse to get adapted to the system that they were imposed to. And something that is very important here is to understand the relationship they have with their own territory. It's a self-knowledge process, but taking into account anthropological aspects. So these communities really leave their means. And when we use this word like community, quilombola community, we're not only talking about the land, nature, and environment. We're talking about the bodies that compose this territory, because the territory is composed by the people, the beings that are live or not, so everything that is involved in this space. So it's important for us to understand that it goes beyond the physical delimitation of the territory. It's also important to highlight here and to link with climate justice and COP30, so we can understand where the quilombola communities are in the territory, Brazilian territory. In this map, that was published by the Brazilian Institute of Geography and Statistics, IBGE, they had an identitary census carried out where they had a marker, a quilombola marker, to understand how many quilombolas live in Brazil. And they also tried to identify where the communities are based. Here we can see, I don't know if you see my arrow.
Yes, we do.
But here, this is the limit of Amazônia Legal. That is basically where COP30 is going to happen. It's going to be in this state of Pará. And here we have a map of demographic density that helps us to understand that the biggest group, biggest concentration of quilombola communities is within the space of Amazônia Legal. It's also important for us to notice that all the categories that we're working with are categories that were introduced recently to the territories that have to do with climate justice, ecology. However, they come from ancestral practice. These communities work with this based on conscious practices. They know they cannot explore the environment without any control, because they know this can cause a collapse in the environment. Also, it's important to understand that the quilombola movement in Brazil has over 50 years. However, it's been only 20 years since it got consolidated as an organization. There is an organization, a national level, that puts on the table the more systematic dialogues, discussions that translate the desires of all the territories. The communities have been working for some years now on some works that have to do with climate justice. And I listed 7 actions that I think that could bring more awareness about the moment we're building here. One of the actions, one of the strategies that the communities have, and that truly influence in the preservation, environmental preservation, and also social and climate justice, has to do with the territory, the land titling. the Brazilian state has an obligation on titling those lands to really giving them the right ownership of these areas. And in the map that we see, just saw now, we noticed that most communities are in the Amazônia Legal. However, there are some other studies that help us understanding that the most preserved spaces, not only of the Amazon, but also other biomes, are the ones where those traditional communities live. So, land titling is gonna affect proportionately and directly in the preservation of those areas. Another strategy of the Quilombola movement has to do with occupying the spaces. And I talk about this, titling the territories, taking into account what Malcolm Ferdinand just, that I just showed to you, what he used to publicize and say that those are areas of resistance, and also thinking about what Shikumen says, the political occupation that is not going to be separated from the climate justice. And when I talk about political spaces, this is one of the new movements of the that they're doing, that is to occupy the elective political spaces. For example, councilmen, deputies, congressmen. So occupying this decision-making spaces is also crucial for bringing more climate justice. And also I understand that the transversal agenda dialogue, in a sense, that going beyond occupying these spaces in the politics, they also have to occupy spaces in decision making, understanding where they can be, so they can make a difference in actions and decisions that make a difference in their lives. And also, every time there is a transition from one administration to another, there are spaces for nomination of people to occupy jobs, and the Quilombola movement could make a movement so they could occupy some of those jobs. And also we have some other strategies that have to do with the world articulation, or like the whole American continent, where we have the International Coalition of Afro-Descendant Territories and Peoples in Latin America and the Caribbean. This coalition doesn't exist only to think about all this agenda, but also to tackle going beyond the environmental agenda. It's a very important space because they bring other traditional communities together so they can talk about their national challenges. Also, there is this encounter that was created for Afro-descendant voices to meet before the COP30, and specifically, of course, COP30. This moment of having this event, the climate change conference in Brazil, is important, so the communities, Quilombola communities, could get closer to this, because now they have more tools to negotiate. For example, 4 months ago, the COP board wrote a letter where they neglected the presence of Quilombola communities in Brazil and their contribution to keep the standing forest and all this process of climate justice. And there was a huge movement coordinated by CONARC, where they ratified this letter. And like 2 days ago, there was an announcement of COP30 president with a change in their statement. And I think now this is something that shows how empowered these communities are. Also, a lot of investments are coming to the sector, and these investments are qualifying the Quilombola leadership in this process of training so they can occupy this COP spaces in a more qualified way. Also, we have the Black Women March that is going to be after COP30. However, it's going to be another space to discuss just climate justice for Black women. So I think these are the main strategies that we have for Quilombola communities, the most relevant ones at least. And Brazilian state is also working in a very incipient process currently to tackle challenges that are like long-standing challenges, so they can bring effective responses for Quilombola and traditional communities. The state is in a process of reconstruction right now. And by that we mean there was a process that destroyed the public machine structured. These 2 years of the government were basically just to rethink, rebuild everything that was dismantled by the previous government. I'm trying to be optimistic here, but one of the main strategies of this government has to do with the transversality. The government in this process of transition, they have to understand the transversality and absorb it. So all the ministries that are emblematic and that dialogue with the agenda of traditional communities, they created secretariats or boards directly connected to the Quilombola communities. I'm not going to bring 2 examples. We have a board, Quilombola board in INCRA, that is the body that takes care of territory access. Also, we have another one, a secretariat within the Agrarian Development Ministry that they take care of access to land, but also the fostering of the territories and the permanence of these communities in the territories. We also have another secretariat that works with all the policies regarding the Quilombola communities and their agenda. Also, within the Ministry of Health, there is another secretariat connected to Quilombola communities. So all this helped to build public policies directly connected to Quilombola communities, and those were very important achievements in these 2 first years. Also, the state responded this demand based on the prioritization of the titling, because the communities need a titling so they can live in those areas. And we understood that the Brazilian state finally prioritized this, and this prioritization may be seen through 3 different points of view. The first one is the restructuring of INCRA. That is where I work nowadays. INCRA went through a process of restructuring where they created the Quilombola board so we could respond to this demand of access to territories. This is something that really shows the prioritization of the government, but above all, budget. It's impossible to make public policies without capital, without money, and we could have this prioritization in the budget. And they have approved over 137 million reais, Brazilian reais, for the agenda of quilombola movements. And this is very important. And above all, the human resources. Finally, we had the state had a public opening, a public call for jobs, and we are finally receiving more people that is going to work, and it's been like 20 years since the last public context, open call better. And also we have two different policies that are very important ones too. The National Policy for Quilombola Territorial and Environmental Management and the National Policy for Comprehensive Health Care of the Quilombola population. Because these are important policies so these people can live well in their own territories. We're talking about policies here that are going to foster the knowledge of the territory and also that has a plan for the territory, thinking about this territory based on their specificities. So the one connected to the territorial one, they have two axes. And one of the axes is to identify the public policies that are lacking. And based on this, these are the ones, the actions that the Brazilian state is working with. And coming back and citing again Malcolm Ferdinand, he says, well, he uses the word ship that I think is kind of racist. However, he talks about a new ship, and it says, we have to think about mechanisms so we can understand ecology and climate and social justice based on the traditional knowledges. And thinking like this is think out of the box, because when you think about social justice, they will only make sense if we're able to see all the external factors that lead us to understand how modernity got to this point, how we got here. And really, we need a change, and this change has to be radical. We cannot have like a scaled change. We're talking about changing the political system, economical system, and these are spaces that it's going to be hard for us to conclude without taking into consideration the needs of the quilombola communities. That's it. Thank you.
Oi, Mônica. Poxa, muito obrigado
Hello,
mesmo
Monica.
pela sua
Thank you
apresentação.
for your
Foi
presentation.
ótima.
It
Eu
was
acho que ela
great.
traz descortino
I
geral
think
super interessante
it
que
brings
pode ser agora
something that is very
trabalhado
interesting,
a
and now we
partir,
can
né, dessa nossa interação
we
aqui
can work
e de perguntas,
better with
né?
our
A gente vai ter
interaction and
tempinho
questions
agora
and
para
answer.
perguntas
We're going to give some time
e
for
eu
people
queria
to
aproveitar e já fazer
ask their
uma
questions,
enquanto o
and
pessoal
I
aí
want to take
vai se
advantage and
preparando.
ask my question.
Quem quiser pode colocar a
In the
pergunta aqui por
meantime, in
escrito
case you want, you
e eu
can
e a
write
Laila
your
podemos
questions in English,
né,
and
traduzir
Laila
aqui
and
para
I are
português,
going
ou
to
se vocês
translate them
preferirem podem
into
fazer a
Portuguese,
pergunta,
or
né?
if you
É só
prefer,
levantar a mãozinha aí, né?
you
Colocar
can like
o
raise your
interesse, fazer a
hands
pergunta
and
e fazer em inglês mesmo, abrir o vídeo
raise your
e
hand
o
by
áudio,
using
fazer em inglês, que a gente
the
traduz para o
feature
português para a
in
Mônica.
in
E
Zoom,
depois
and
a
you
nossa
can
Renata,
ask your
né,
questions
a intérprete aqui, a
in
nossa intérprete
English, and the
maravilhosa,
interpreter
pode fazer
is
toda
going
outra parte de
to
tradução.
translate everything,
Então,
okay?
é,
While we discuss the
Mônica, eu
questions.
gostaria assim de trazer essa
Monica,
questão
I wanted
que eu acho
to
que é interessante,
bring
que,
something
que é
that is
pensar
interesting
que
because
houve, né, trazendo essa questão do processo histórico que você
thinking
colocou, né,
about
houve
the
um processo
historic
histórico
process
de
that you mentioned,
afastamento, vamos dizer assim,
there was a historical movement
das
to
populações negras, né, que inclusive tem como
to
uma origem, né, um
put
pouco
the
dessa ideia
black
toda do quilombo, tem a ver
population
com a ideia de
aside
fuga, né, do
from what was
sistema
happening,
escravocrata, né,
including
do processo de
the
escravização.
Quilombos. They
E
are
essa fuga se dava então
somehow
para áreas que eram áreas que não
runaway
eram
from
vistas como áreas
the
importantes
slavery
economicamente,
system,
áreas que não tinham
and
um
they
interesse em
ran
especial
away
por
to
parte,
areas that were
inicialmente,
not
dos
interesting,
colonizadores, né,
as we can say,
da coroa
like
portuguesa
places where they
e
weren't
depois
interested.
da
The
República do Estado
colonizers
brasileiro,
weren't
né?
interested.
Passando por esse
And
período de
afterwards, the
transição
Republic,
que o Brasil
Brazilian
teve de
Republic,
império,
too,
né?
thinking about the transition that Brazil
E
faced from
a
an
gente vê, você
empire
mostrou ali
into
no
a
mapa, né,
republican
a
system.
presença
And
quilombola, né?
then
Inclusive você
you
destacou essa
showed the
questão
presence,
da
the
Amazônia
Quilombola
Legal,
presence in the map,
e
and you
isso
highlighted the
traz para mim
Amazônia
uma
Legal.
questão de que
And
essas
this makes me
áreas
think that these
eram áreas que
areas
antes não eram
were
áreas
areas
exploradas
that
economicamente,
before
né? Eram áreas que
they
eram vistas
weren't
como muito difícil
economically
acesso, áreas
explored. They were
longe da
like hard
costa,
to
né? Que não
access
tinham essa
areas,
ligação
or they were
direta com a
far away
Europa,
from the
né?
coast. They didn't have any
É,
like direct connection
e
with
isso acontece, por
European
exemplo, você
colonizers.
está no centro do país e a gente sabe que
And when
o
you are like in the
maior
center of the
território em
country, you
termos,
know that
né, de
the
extensão são os
largest
Calungas,
territory
né?
when it
Que
comes to
estão numa área
extension are the
extremamente árida,
Kalungas,
né? Muito
where
seca.
they
Apesar de
live
terem
in a
rios
very
enormes,
dry
é uma
area,
área
very
bastante
arid
seca. E os
areas.
próprios Calungas falam
Despite of
sobre
the
isso
fact they
também.
have
Antes
rivers
ninguém queria
there, they live in a
essas
very
terras, né?
arid
Só que
areas, and
agora existe um
Kalungas
processo
usually
todo de
say
pressão
this
enorme sobre esses
beforehand.
territórios
No
quilombolas
one
na
wanted
Amazônia,
those
nessas
areas, but
áreas
now they are facing a lot of
áridas, né?
pressure
Onde os quilombolas, as
on
populações
to
negras
leave
foram,
these areas,
ou
these
altos de
arid or
morros,
the
né?
Amazon or like
Onde
the
essas populações
hills
negras foram
where the
produzir suas
black
vidas, né? Suas
communities
casas, se
were
reproduzir, né?
displaced so they
Culturalmente,
could leave and they
espiritualmente, né?
could
Economicamente. Então,
reproduce
resumindo,
in
né, eu
like in
gostaria
a
um pouco de
holistic
ouvir, assim,
way.
da sua
I
visão, que
mean,
está trabalhando com essa pauta fundiária,
spiritually
né, trabalhando com
and
a questão territorial, diretamente
professionally,
a partir do
etc.
Estado, sendo
And
do
now,
movimento
based
quilombola,
on your
como que
point of
você vê
view,
essa questão de que antes não
working
se tinha
directly with
interesse
the
e
state
agora
and the Quilombola
tudo que se
communities,
quer são essas áreas,
what,
porque
how
eram
do you
áreas que ficaram
see? Because
conservadas do ponto de
before they
vista
didn't want,
ambiental,
and no one
porque houve
wanted anything
uma
with these
forma de
areas. However,
desenvolvimento, uma
now
maneira de
everyone,
viver,
like
de
all
se
the eyes are
reproduzir
on these areas
diferente
because
daquela que
they
estava
were
acontecendo,
preserved,
principalmente na
because
costa do Brasil, né?
whoever lived in those areas preserved them differently. What is your point of view on that?
Perfeito, Bruno. Eu acho
Perfect,
que
Bruno. I
vale
think
a pena a gente destacar que existem
it's worth mentioning
processos diferentes de
that there
formação de
are
quilombos, né?
different processes
Tem esse
of
quilombo
formation
mais
of
antigo, eu
quilombos.
acho que dialoga muito
The
com o que você
most
colocou, que parte
antique
do processo
ones,
de
the
fuga,
oldest
né?
ones, that were
De
like part
fuga
of the
dos
runaway
colonizadores,
process,
né? E esse processo
runaway
de
from the
fuga,
colonizers,
ele
and
ocorria
this
para lugares mais
runaway
distantes,
process
né?
had to
E
do
aí,
with
assim, longe,
going the
né? Dos
furthest they could,
grandes núcleos
and
urbanos
also
ocupados. E
like
aí
going
tem outros processos de
further
aquilombamento,
from
né, também. Mas eu
the
acho que
cores where like
onde a gente
the
consegue
populated
identificar
cores.
hoje, né, esse
And
maior
what we
interesse
identify
nas áreas
today
são esses que foram
is that
inicialmente
they have
criados, né, desse
interest
processo
in
de
the
resistência
areas
mesmo.
that the
E
first
aí
ones
também
that
é
were created
importante
during
entender
this
como o
resistance
processo de
process. And it's important to
desenvolvimento, né, e o
understand
capitalismo,
how
ele
the
vai influenciando
capitalism and
os
the
dogmas modernos, né?
development process
Enquanto em um
influence the
determinado
modern
momento, né,
dogma. while at some point people understood that monoculture and exploration were what could assure development and urbanism of empires, now we see a change in this paradigm. What we notice today is that you need to explore less, you need to contribute more. And also, it's important to highlight something that I didn't mention that has to do with carbon credit. Today, we also have some direction from the developed countries to sell themselves politically and environmentally in a positive way based on the carbon credits, things that were like before didn't have anything to do with the way they were working or like the way they fought. Now they think about this. And that's why we need to title those areas the fastest we can, because they are object of interest, not only private interest, but like domestic interest, but international interest. The communities are going through a level of vulnerability when they don't have the titling of those lands that is unprecedented. Because now everyone understands that what's good is what's preserved, although they never preserved anything. All right, thank you, Monica. I also want to make a connection with Fábio Martins' open lecture, and he's from Quilombo do Campinho, and has to do with what we're talking about, because he talked about ancestry in his lecture and also the past and how the past is present today. Also, he mentioned two things that were important: trauma, and he said that the experience of being quilombola and black in Brazil have some components that hurt and that are part of the lives of those people, and are present not in their bodies, spiritually and physically, this trauma. And he talked about something that was very interesting, because, and it has to do with what you said. He said that the presence in the territory, including the thing that he mentioned, that he is working in a film, and he was in Africa, in different countries there, where he could see people that he identified as his peers. And this brought him a perspective of healing. And healing has a lot to do with justice, because justice is a kind of reparation. There were crimes, violences that have to be repaired, healed. And when you mention the first strategy as titling, I think it has to do with this, don't you? Bruno is muted.
Mônica caiu.
I think Monica
Tá. I think
lost
Monica
connection.
just dropped off the line, so I'm going to write to her a message here.
Ela tá aqui.
Ah, tá aqui?
Tá.
Cadê?
Você chegou a me escutar?
She's
Mônica?
back. Monica, did you hear me?
I didn't see her. Did she come back and then fell off again?
I don't see her. Laila, você tá me ouvindo? Ela tá sem
Oi,
áudio,
Mônica.
gente.
Oi, gente, eu caí, mas já voltei. Já levantei.
Laila is
Tá?
back.
Você chegou a escutar, então, a minha pergunta?
Did you hear my
Não, não
question?
escutei.
No, I'm
Bom,
sorry,
o que
I
eu estava colocando
couldn't.
para mim é essa, né? A questão, resumidamente,
Yes,
como
I
que
was.
você
Well,
vê
let
essa
me try to
relação entre
summarize. How do
a
you
titulação
see
dos
the
contratos
relationship
pela população
between
para
land
diminuindo o
titling that
movimento quilombola
you
hoje,
mentioned
com
as the
essa
number
questão da
one
cura,
strategy
né?
of
E
Quilombola
estar
movement
em-
with
com seus
the
pares, estar
healing,
num lugar
being with your
especificamente, que é uma coisa que o
peers,
Fábio
being
Martins trouxe
with
muito a partir dessa
people who
relação com
are
a África, né? Mas que
like
eu acho
you.
que isso
And
funciona também para dentro
we
dos
heard a lot
territórios
of this
afrodescendentes no Brasil,
when
né?
we had the lecture of Fábio
Perfeito.
Martins when
É
he
meio
talked about
filosófico, né?
this. Yes, it's kind of philosophical,
Mas
isn't it?
eu entendo
But
sim que é um
yes,
processo
I
de cura,
understand.
né?
This is a healing process.
Existem, né, violações que são
There are some
irreparáveis, né?
violations that cannot be
E aí,
repaired.
quando a gente fala
And
do
when we
processo de
talk about
escravização, eu entendo
the
que é uma
slavery
dessas
process,
violações, né, que são
I
irreparáveis.
understand that this is
E
one
aí, quando a
of
gente
the
também fala sobre cura, sobre
irreversible
estar entre os nossos para nos curarmos,
violences.
né? Como
And
o Fábio
when we talk
colocou,
about healing and being with our
viver na
peers
filosofia banto, né?
so we can
Assim,
heal
é viver
is
o
has to
Ubuntu.
do
E
with
aí eu não sei se
living
preciso
the
explicar.
Ubuntu.
Mas na
Maybe I should
filosofia
explain this,
banto,
but
né, o Ubuntu é nós
the
por nós.
Bantu philosophy
E
and
aí, quando a gente
Ubuntu
fala sobre
philosophy
território, a gente está falando
means
disso, né? O
we
território são as
for
pessoas, né?
us. And
Território
when we
são os
talk
vínculos de
about the
parentesco.
territory has to do
Território
with
são as
people
vivências que
with the
só aquela
parenthood,
comunidade, a partir
with
daquela
the
coletividade,
family
sabe,
members
né? E,
bonds and being in
e
this
vivencia.
community where this
E aí, quando a
community
gente
really
fala
lives
de se
that.
curar, é
And
exatamente
when we talk
isso,
about
né? É
healing
entender
ourselves,
que
that has to do exactly with this.
existe uma correlação, inclusive, de
Understanding that there
dependência
is a
entre
correlation
as
and
pessoas que formam o território
a
quilombola,
certain
né?
dependence
E o elo, na verdade,
between the
entre
people,
todas
among the
as
people
pessoas
who
é a
are
terra,
in
é o
the Quilombola
território.
communities,
Então,
and
assim, são
their
coisas que eu entendo que
link
são
is the land, the
indissociáveis, né?
territory. So
Assim,
I think these are
é
things that cannot
filosófico, é
be
ancestral,
separated.
mas
It is
é
philosophical
ser quilombola
and
isso, né? É
it
verdadeiramente
has to
ser
do with
quilombola.
being Quilombola. That's what I think.
Obrigada, Mônica. Eu queria
Thank you, Monica.
fazer um breve comentário de
I just want to
conexão
comment
com as
something
leituras e
that
as
has to
discussões que a
do
gente está
with
tendo no
some
nosso
connection
curso
with the
de
reading and the
política e
discussions
ciência da
we
conservação,
have been
que eu acho que você desenhou muito bem a
having in our
importância
course of politics
da
and
justiça
preservation.
para a justiça ambiental, né? Para a gente
And
poder ter
you
justiça
really
climática e para
made
poder ter
a
justiça
connection that is
ambiental,
interesting
a
because
gente precisa primeiro
if we want to
pensar em
have
como promover
climate
a
and
justiça no sentido mais
environmental and
amplo,
social justice, we have to
inclusive
think
dentro
about
de um
how we
contexto que a
can
gente está falando
work in a
aqui dos
broader
Estados Unidos e do
way when it
Brasil,
comes to
que
justice,
passaram por um
especially when we
período
think
bastante
about the
recente, em termos
US
históricos,
and
de escravidão,
Brazil
né?
that
Então,
went through a
reconhecer isso
recent
como
moment
parte
of
de uma política
slavery. And we
ambiental
have to acknowledge
é
this
um
as part of
fundamento para a gente
environmental
reconhecer
policies.
a
This
política
is
ambiental como um instrumento de
paramount so
justiça
we can
ambiental, né?
understand
Isso
environmental
muito
justice
conectado
as
com o que a gente está trabalhando na
um,
aula. E aí eu queria te fazer uma
that can
pergunta
be
link e vou te
disassociated
colocar também
of
uma
the
pergunta que uma
social
aluna fez
justice.
aqui no chat.
And I have a question for you
É,
here.
da minha perspectiva, seria muito legal
From my
escutar
point
da
of
sua
view, it would be
parte
great to hear
como
from
que
you
você vê essa relação
on how do you
entre
see
a política pública que
the relationship
precisa
between public
generalizar para poder
policies
acontecer,
that
né?
has to
E
be
precisa
generic
colocar
to
soluções que
happen
sejam
and that
abrangentes para
has
todo
to
mundo,
bring
e
solutions
o
that are
conhecimento
more like
tradicional que é tão típico de cada um dos
comprehensive.
territórios, né? Como dar conta dessa
So
diversidade
to
incrível dos
work for
quilombos
everyone. And
e ainda
also,
assim, né, você nesse
how
meio do
can
caminho,
you
sendo
tackle
quilombola
this
e
huge
gestora pública ao
diversity
mesmo tempo,
of the
como que você
quilombos?
transita
And being a
essa tensão,
quilombola
né,
and a
entre
public
a especificidade de
manager at the
cada um
same
dos
time, how do
territórios
you
e a
work with
dinamização
this
da
based
política
on
pública?
the
E a
specificities
pergunta
of
que foi
each
feita pela
quilombo and
Alexis, que é a
also
aluna aqui
thinking
nessa
about
sessão
a more generic
é a seguinte.
approach to
Ela
build those
pergunta
public
como os
policies.
outros
And now the
movimentos
question
dos
from
afrodescendentes, ou seja, o
Alex
movimento
is,
negro, eu
how
imagino que ela
have
esteja falando
other
do movimento
movements like
negro
the
no Brasil,
Afro-descendants
ou a Marcha das Mulheres Negras
and Black Women's
influencia,
March
né, ou tem
influenced
uma relação de
or
reciprocidade
has a
com os direitos territoriais
relationship
quilombolas?
of
E aí
reciprocity
ela pergunta
with
também, né, uma segunda parte da pergunta,
the
qual que
Quilombolas'
é
land rights. And
a
another
relação
question
do
has to
movimento
do with
quilombola e do
what is
movimento
the
negro, das
Quilombolas and
das
Black
mulheres
movement,
negras,
Black Women's
com a
March,
cobertura da
etc.,
mídia,
with
né? Então, o
media
papel da mídia
coverage.
nisso aí.
So what is
Bom,
the
3
role of the
perguntas.
media? Well, actually, three
Aí eu te
questions
passo a
in one.
palavra.
Then
Obrigada,
I hand
Mônica,
you
foi
the floor.
maravilhoso.
Thank you, Monica. It was great.
Nada, Laila. Sobre a política pública, né? A
When it comes to
generalização e pensar em uma política mais específica
public
a
policies,
partir
how
da
to
observação
unite
dos saberes tradicionais.
something more
Aí eu
generic
coloco
with
essa
something more
oportunidade como uma
specific
obrigação
based
do
on
Estado
the
brasileiro, né?
traditional
Desde o momento que o
knowledge.
Estado ele
Actually,
trouxe
this is
no
an
mercado
obligation
na
of the
Convenção
state,
69,
Brazilian state.
ele trouxe para
Since
si uma
the Brazilian
obrigação
state
de, em
became
todos
a
os atos
signatory of the
políticos, né?
Convention
E
199, we have
administrativos que
all
afetem
this,
as comunidades quilombolas, de dialogar com essas
every act that
comunidades. E,
has
na
to do
verdade,
and affect the Quilombola
a
communities
categoria jurídica
have
que
to go
trabalha na
through the
política é
Quilombola
consulta, né?
communities. And
Quando
then
tem uma
by that we
primeira
mean a consultation should be made.
primeiro recorte, que é uma obrigação
And we
legal do
have
Estado em fazer, ou
one
seja,
that is like a
consultar a
legal
base
obligation
para
of the
pensar a política
state,
pública,
and
né?
by that I
E aí a
mean
gente tem outros fundamentos que é da própria
checking,
questão pública, que para uma política pública
consulting the
ela ser
basis
eficiente,
to
ela tem que ser
build any
trabalhada
kind of
a
policy. And
partir
another one
da escuta
that has to do with the
qualitativa, né,
fact
e
that a
qualitativa
public
do
policy
próprio ente
will only be
beneficiário. Uma
efficient
política que é feita
if
de
it's
escritório, né,
based
ela não
on the
consegue chegar onde
beneficiaries
ela deve
who's
chegar.
going to receive.
Então, assim,
Otherwise,
eu
it's not
entendo
going to
que
achieve its goal.
o Brasil, né, nesses 2 anos,
I
Laila, o brasileiro,
understand
ele
that
conseguiu
Brazil, in these 2 years,
verdadeiramente,
the
né,
Brazilian state really was
realizar
able
as
to
consultas livres, prévias e informadas
uh,
na medida da
conduct
sua
the
capacidade, né? Não estou
consultation
dizendo que é no
based
cenário
on
ideal,
its
mas conseguiu fazer
capacity.
muito com o que
It's
tem
not the
hoje, né?
ideal
E
scenario,
aí eu falo
but it
isso
was able
também
to
só
do a
para
lot
colocar
with the
aquela
little it
política que eu
has.
falei. As duas políticas
And
que eu falei,
also,
tanto a de saúde quanto a de gestão
the two
territorial, elas foram
policies,
feitas a
both
partir
of
desse
the
custo
territorial management
Então,
and
tem
another
leis
one
na
of
política de
healthcare,
saúde
they
que é focada em
were
medicina
constructed
tradicional. E eles
based
vão incorporar
on
isso
the
no
consultation
SUS,
of the
né?
base.
Tem
And
leis
one,
no
for
TJK
example,
que é só
brings
para fazer a cartografia
traditional
social do
medicine
território
and
e
it's going to be
entender
incorporated in the public health
as áreas
system.
do
Another one
sagrado,
has to
né?
do with
Desenhar
mapping
quais
the
são as áreas de
territory,
potencial para
designing the
agricultura.
potential
Então,
lands
tudo isso
for agriculture, for
foi
example.
feito, né? Foi
And
pensado
all
na
this
política a
was
partir dessa escuta. E eu
fought
acho que
based
também, para a
on hearing
efetividade do
the
governo,
communities.
tem
So
que
I
ter
think,
uma
like for the
estratégia muito
government, this
doméstica.
is
Eu
a
não entendo que
very
deva ser replicado em todos os
important
estados que são
strategy that
signatários, né, da
probably is going to be
Convenção
replicated in
169.
other states
Aí,
that are
sobre a
signatory
outra
of
pergunta,
169
como os outros movimentos influenciam
agreement.
nos
And
direitos
another one has to
territoriais
do
dos
with
quilombolas, né?
how
Mas ela está falando
how
especificamente
the
do
movements
movimento negro,
influence.
né? Acho que ela
Yeah, but she's
estava
talking
aqui querendo
about the
saber um
black
pouco da
movement
interação entre o movimento
specifically. I
quilombola
think
e
it
o
has to
movimento
do with
negro mais
this.
amplo, né?
What is like the interaction between
Perfeito.
Quilombola movement and the black
Então,
movement,
eu
like in
acho
a broader
que
way?
na historicidade,
Nice.
né, da construção do
Well,
movimento
in the
quilombola,
history
é
of the
importante que a
construction
gente
of
registre que inicialmente
the
ele
Quilombola
cresceu
movement,
dentro do movimento negro, né? E a
it
partir
has
da
to, we have to
expansão do
understand that
movimento
it
negro,
was born
houve a
in from
necessidade de se,
the black movement. And
de
based on
se
this,
recortar,
there was a
né,
need
aquela pasta,
to
porque
report to
verdadeiramente
that agenda.
os aspectos mais gerais do movimento
Because
negro
truly,
não dialogavam com as necessidades
the more like
territoriais, né, da
general
identidade
aspects of the
quilombola.
black movement
A criação do
didn't
movimento negro,
didn't
né,
talk
a criação do
to
movimento
the
quilombola
needs
surge
of the
dentro do
lands
movimento
related
negro.
to the
Então,
Quilombola,
acaba
but
sendo
Quilombola was
estratégia
born
unificada.
within the
acho que também
Black
vale a
movement.
pena a gente
They are
colocar,
connected. However, it's
eu
important
acho
to
que vai
mention
ser
that,
uma discussão mais aprofundada, mas sobre o
well,
que é negro, o
we
que é
needed more
preto,
time
né, dentro dessa
to understand
esfera
what
política,
is
né? A gente
like
está trabalhando a categoria negra como uma
black
categoria
in
política
Brazil.
e administrativa
Black
criada,
in Brazil
inclusive, pelo
is a
IBGE, né?
political
Foi aquele
category
instituto que fez
created by
o
IBGE,
mapeamento das comunidades
IBGE,
quilombolas.
that
Então, no
mapped the
Brasil,
Quilombola
entende-se negro
communities.
não só as
In
pessoas
Brazil, we
pretas,
understand
né,
as
mas as
black
pessoas
not only the
pardas também.
black people, but
E
also
tem
the
uma
brown people
construção
as well.
do negro
So
a partir de
we
várias
have the construction
esferas, né?
of black
Então, a gente
here
vê
in Brazil
uma
based on
conjugação de
different
pautas que foram incapazes de
perspectives.
tratar com a
And there
especificidade que
were
precisava
some
tratar a pauta
agenda
quilombola.
that
Por isso que
couldn't
houve, né, a necessidade
handle
de se afastar em
specifically
algum momento
and
do
efficiently
movimento.
the
Mas são
Quilombola
movimentos
movements
irmãos, né,
and
que
needs.
trabalham juntos, né?
That's why at some
E
point
eu acho
we
que a
needed to
construção
separate
ainda
it
hoje é
then
muito
separate them.
placa
However,
né?
they are
Não existe
connected, they
competição
walk
entre elas duas
together.
pautas, são
There is
pautas que
no
se somam
competition
no
between them.
final das
They
contas, né?
one add to the
Ela
E
other.
aí
pergunta assim, Mônica,
And
ela
he
fez
asks,
essa questão direta, né? Assim,
he
e
asks
como
something
que,
directly here.
como você colocou na sua apresentação, a Marcha das
And
Mulheres
like,
Negras
what about
especificamente
the
atua
Black Women's March specifically?
no apoio aos direitos
Work
territoriais
on
quilombolas.
supporting the territorial rights of Quilombola communities.
Perfeito. Então,
Nice.
assim, acho que a gente
I
precisa
think
colocar que
it's
as
important to
comunidades
mention that
quilombolas, em sua
Quilombola
maioria, são
communities
comunidades
mostly
matriarcais, né?
are
Onde as lideranças principais são
matriarchies,
mulheres.
where the main leaders are
E aí,
women.
a Marcha da Mulher, e não só o movimento
Then
negro, tem
the
não só a
Black
marcha, mas
women,
também o movimento negro,
March,
tem
not only it,
muita
but the Black movement
contribuição nesse aspecto, né? Que foi
has
o
a lot of
próprio aspecto
contribution
de
in this
formação
sense
dessas lideranças, né?
because
Que
it
eles
was
têm
important
essa
for the formation
tendência
of
mais
those
política de formação das
leadership.
lideranças, mas
So we
também tem
have
uma ambiência mais de construção
a,
que na Marcha
a
das
pol
Mulheres Negras, né,
politic
existem
side of
coletivos
this formation.
específicos de
However,
mulheres
for
negras
example, in the
quilombolas, né?
Black
Então, quando
Women
essas
March, there
mulheres se
is a
reúnem, né? E a marcha,
specific
ela tem
collective
como
of
principal
Black
resultado
women,
a elaboração de uma carta
of
dessas
women from
mulheres, né?
Quilombola
Sobre quais são as
movements.
necessidades
So,
atuais das
based
mulheres
on
negras.
this,
E
there
na
is
última
a
marcha, que foi
letter
lá em
written
2012,
only
né?
by
Mais
the
de
Quilombola
10 anos
Black
que foi
women.
a marcha,
And
houve
like
necessariamente, né,
in the
a
last March,
necessidade de
there was
se pensar
specifically
a
the
formação
need
política das
to
mulheres
think
negras
about
quilombolas e de
the
titulação dos
political
territórios.
training
Então,
of
assim,
Quilombola
tem uma ligação
women
muito
and also
profunda,
the
né?
titling
As mulheres
of
negras
the
que
lands.
conseguem
So there is a
se
deep
dividir
connection
dentro da
between
marcha em
them. Like
coletivos de
the
grandes
Black women
pautas
that
e
is within the
cada
march, they
especificidade de
can
mulher negra é colocada nesse
uh,
instrumental
they
que
have some
posteriormente é
divisions
entregue para o
where
governo, né?
each group of Black
E a
women
mídia,
bring
falando
their
sobre a
own
Isso.
mídia, né?
Só
agenda.
para finalizar, eu
Uh,
queria te pedir
all right,
para
the
falar
media.
pouquinho sobre a
Yes, of
mídia,
course.
sobre o
I
papel da
will talk
mídia e da
about
cobertura da
the
mídia
role
nesse
of the
processo.
media and the coverage.
Gente, assim, a mídia, ela, no Brasil, nesses últimos 6 anos,
Media in Brazil in the
ela
last
influenciou
100
demais,
years
né,
influenced
na
a lot
construção de ideais, inclusive de ideais
in building
irracionais. E foi só assim que eu acho que
irrational
tanto o
values,
governo
actually.
quanto
And
os
that's
próprios
how
movimentos sociais
the
se
government and
atentaram
social
à necessidade
movements
de se comunicar com
got
mais
aware they had to
veemência, né?
communicate
E aí de utilizar
with in a
ferramentas não
more
só no eixo
robust way
televisivo, mas sobretudo
and
nas
using
grandes
tools not only based
plataformas,
on TV,
né, de
but also
comunicação, como o
in the
Instagram, né,
main
Facebook,
communication
Twitter.
platforms,
Então,
also,
a
or
mídia
like
consegue
social media, for
influenciar
example,
amplamente. Eu
Instagram,
falo isso
Twitter,
para dizer
etc.
que a gente viveu 4
Because
anos de
media
fake news,
influence a
né,
lot.
em que a
We
mídia
lived
foi
4
responsável
years of
pela,
fake news,
pela
and media
construção
was responsible for
de ideologias, né, errôneas, eu vou falar
constructing
assim também, sendo muito
wrong
extremista, né?
ideologies.
E aí a gente entende assim, que a mídia tem um papel fundamental, né? Tem também,
And
de
we
todos esses
understand the
coletivos que
media
eu
has
coloquei, né? Todos os
like
encontros,
a
eles fazem um encontro para
fundamental
ver
role.
qual a importância da
In
mídia.
all
Eles
those
fazem
meetings I
isso
mentioned, they
com
have a
comunicadores
meeting
sociais,
based
porque o movimento
only
entendeu que
on
só
the
consegue fazer
media
política,
coverage and
gente,
importance
só consegue
because,
chegar
and including
onde
there
deve
is
chegar se
one
souber se
meeting
comunicar.
where they
Então,
have
tanto a
social
marcha das
communicators.
mulheres, né,
And they
quanto
finally
o
understood
encontro
that they will only be
afrodescendente,
able to
quanto
communicate
o encontro de
if
votos,
they
os coletivos,
know how
né,
to communicate
os
with the
coletivos de
media.
cada movimento
So
de
all the different
comunicadores
movements
sociais,
like Black
eles,
Women's
eles
March
fazem
movement and
collabs, né,
others,
eles fazem
they have some collabs
publicações conjuntas por
and some
entenderem que esse
posts
hoje é um
like
fundamento
they
para
post
modificar a
together
história,
because
né, a
they finally
partir dessa
understood that
interlocução
this is
com o
important
grande
to
público,
change
né, com a
the
massa.
history.
Então, a mídia é
To
responsável
that's the way
por
to
isso.
communicate with the mass, and media is responsible for that.
Posso te fazer uma última pergunta, ainda que a
May
gente
I
ainda tem um
ask
pouquinho
you
de
one
tempo,
last
Mônica?
question since we have some
Pode,
time?
claro.
Porque
Yes, for
você
sure.
mencionou bastante
You
bem também na
mentioned
sua apresentação
in your
todos os
presentation
movimentos que estão sendo construídos
all
pelo
the different
movimento
movements
quilombola no
that are
Brasil,
being
no sentido de
built
preparar
by the Quilombola
uma
movement in Brazil
atuação
in the
presente na
sense of
COP30, que
preparing
vai ser a COP da
to
Convenção
COP,
das Nações
COP
Unidas para as Mudanças
30 that's gonna
Climáticas,
be
que vai
the
ser em Belém, em
UN
novembro desse ano. Nos veremos
Assembly
lá, né?
for Climate Change
Provavelmente.
that is gonna happen in Belém this year, and we'll
E
probably
eu
meet
queria
there.
saber, com um pouco
And I
mais de
wanted to
detalhe,
know in
quais são os
a
tipos
bit
de
in
atividades
more
que vocês
details
estão promovendo
what
nesses
are the
encontros
kind of
e qual a
activities you're promoting
importância
for
da
this
capacitação
meeting,
das
and what is the
pessoas
importance
e a
of
perspectiva
training the
estratégica sobre
people
esse
and the
encontro a partir
strategic
da perspectiva do
perspective
movimento quilombola
of
no
this
Brasil.
meeting based on the Quilombola perspective in Brazil.
Perfeito, perfeito,
All
Laila.
right, perfect.
Assim,
Thank you, Laila.
enquanto Estado, a nossa a
When
gente
it
criou
comes
uma mesa,
to
né,
state,
sobre e aí
we
recentemente a
are going to have a
política de
table, and
regularização
recently
fundiária na
the
Convenção do Clima foi entendida como uma
policy
política de
of
preservação
land
ambiental ano passado, né? Então,
regulation was
o
understood,
grande
finally
eixo é
understood
esse.
as a
E aí,
climate
a nossa
policy
estratégia
last
esse
year, since
ano
last year.
é
So
colocar,
now in
né, essa
this
decisão que foi exarada
year,
dentro
we're
desse
going to
encontro
have this
no
strategy,
nosso ordenamento brasileiro. Então, a política territorial tem que ser vista,
within
enxergada
our
financeiramente como uma
agenda,
ferramenta de justiça
because
climática, né?
like land
O nosso grande
holding
apelo, nossa grande
is
mesa, a gente
one of
escreveu,
the
só para
tools
não
for
ter voz
climate
evolutiva, tá,
justice.
Laila? Se a gente vai
We
conseguir
didn't
ou
receive
não um
an
painel, né?
answer yet if we're
E
gonna
aí
have a panel
é
on
nesse
this,
sentido de colocar,
but
né,
it
o
has to do
NDS,
with
né,
this,
que é essa política geral,
to
a
having a
regularização
general
territorial
policy
como uma
on
política
the
climática e ter
territory
princípios sensíveis.
regulation
Em
as a
tese,
public
que
as
existem, né,
climate
fundos específicos
policy.
para
And why is
as
that?
políticas climáticas, né, que são
Because
fundos
there are
internacionais.
some specific
E a
funds
grande,
for climate
sempre foi, né, uma das grandes
policies, and one
fragilidades
of
para
the
a estruturação
main
da política de
fragilities
acesso à terra e
to
território foi a
make
falta de orçamento.
make
Então, assim,
it
a ideia é
effective,
que a partir desse novo
the
mecanismo
access to
a gente
territories
consiga
be
garantir
effective was
orçamento
lack of
para
budget.
conseguir
So we
articular todas
want to
essas áreas.
have budget to title
Essa foi
all the different areas. I
parte
think
da
that
pergunta,
was
né?
the first
E aí,
part of
como
the
é
question.
importante esses
And
espaços para
how
formação, né,
important
das lideranças.
it is like
E aí eu
this
coloco,
space to
assim, que a COP, né,
develop
é um
leaders.
espaço de muita
I always
visibilidade
mention that
internacional.
COP is
E aí
brings
é
a lot of
muito
visibility,
importante
international
que os
visibility, and
movimentos que
that's why
façam
it's so
presente
important
e
for the
pontuem quais são os
movement to be
gargalos, né,
present and
que eles
to
enfrentam
bring to the
nesses
table
nessas
what
áreas.
are the issues
E
they're
aí
facing in
qualificar
these
esse
areas,
discurso
and also
para que esse
qualifying
discurso dialogue com a
these
realidade
interventions so they can be
internacional, né,
connected to the
que
international
traga
reality,
subsídios, né, que torne esse discurso
bringing the
interessante, que a
subsides
gente sabe que é muito
that
importante,
is
mas
that
não é o
are
que se diz, é
important.
como se diz, né? Então,
And
a
we
gente está
know
entendendo que esse
all this
projeto
is
forma
important, but
sentido para
it
cada
doesn't have
ano,
to
né?
do with
Faz
what we say,
quase
but
2
how we
anos
say it.
que, desde o ano
And it's
passado,
been
né,
like
que o movimento
since
quilombola vem
last
se
year,
preparando para atuar na
the
COP.
Quilombola
Então,
movement
existe
has
muita
been preparing
expectativas,
to
né, do
work in
movimento
COP,
e
to
das lideranças
be
que vão
there.
representar
there
modo
is a
muito mais
lot of
fácil,
expectation
como
among the
porque,
leadership that is
no
going
final
to
das contas,
be
vai ser
present in this
espaço
space, because at
de
the end of the day, it's going to be a space
paradoxos de narrativas, né? Enquanto
for like
as
narrative
grandes nações,
paradoxes.
né, vão fazer uma defesa sobre
On
o
the one
desenvolvimento
hand,
a
the big
partir,
nations are
né,
going to
da confluência de
talk about
interesses,
developing based on
o
the
movimento
interest
quilombola tem que
confluence.
colocar que esse interesse, sobretudo,
Quilombola
tem que
movement
dialogar
has
com os
to
poderes tradicionais, né?
put
Aquilo
on the
do
table
novo
that
navio
this
que o
interest have
Malcolm
to
coloca, né? Que não vai
be
ter como fazer
connected
uma
to
discussão sem levar em
the
consideração
climate,
todos esses
to
fatores.
the social justice. As Malcolm mentioned,
Muito
we
obrigada,
cannot
Mônica. A
discuss
gente
this
já passou
without
aqui
taking
7 minutinhos
all
da
this into
hora.
account.
A
Thank you,
gente vai
Monica.
finalizar
Thank you
aqui a
very
aula.
much. I'm
Aí
going
eu
to
vou
wrap
fazer
up
um
the
fechamento aqui
lecture
em
today.
inglês para os alunos, tá
I'm
bom?
gonna talk in English now
Tá
with the
bom, gente. Eu só
students.
queria
All right,
agradecer mais
thank
uma
you. I
vez
just want to thank you very much
pela
once again for having me.
Tá bom.
It was
Se
great.
eles,
Thank you.
na próxima aula, Mônica, eu vou
Next class,
conversar com eles sobre
I'm
sua
gonna talk to
palestra em
them
inglês na sala de
about
aula.
your
Às
lecture
vezes, eles
in
ficam com um
English.